Hello. In this video, I'll be covering the second of the two key topics regarding the concept of prohibition. Mostly I'll be referring to firearm and weapon prohibition, but really, the criticisms apply to prohibition in general, including the concept of drug prohibition. Now, in my previous video, I talked about the long-term results. In this video, we're going to be talking about practicality. Assuming we can get the ideal scenario manufactured in the previous video, we need to consider the practicality of reaching that point. A person may want, say, a totally weaponless society as their utopia, or they may want a society where everyone is armed as their utopia. But unless you have a path to reach this utopia, it's nothing more than a fantasy. So let's consider the practical implications of gun prohibition, that being a firearm ban indiscriminate of age, criminal record, or mental health. It's a question of what kind of civilization you want to build, and how you intend to go about it. Now, first let's look at the results of prohibition throughout history. They've mostly been disastrous. This isn't the first trip down the rabbit hole for the United States, nor is it for other nations. So there's ample supply of data. In the Gaza Strip, where Hamas rules and has extremely strict legal codes, among which one of those codes is the death penalty for drug possession, drug use, also punishable by death, is rampant. For the United States, we once had prohibition of alcohol, which was completely and utterly disregarded by the citizenry as a whole. Nowadays, we have prohibition of drugs, and if the California police did a major drug bust conducted every day for a full year, it wouldn't even create a minor dent in the drug trade. Not to mention that making these things illegal provokes and involves organized crime that otherwise would have had more limited powers. Many people here in the United States argue that the reason schools keep getting shot up is because we have prohibition, but not enough of it. However, we can take a look at Germany, which continues to have school shootings, for example, despite harsher gun prohibition, as well as censorship. After the Winnenden school shooting, some blame was allocated to video games, much like the NRA blamed video games after the Sandy Hook shooting. However, we can look at South Korea, where gaming is much more socially accepted and thus more common, yet has no school shootings. Therefore, a direct causal link cannot exist. Or if it does exist, it can't be a primary factor, thus voiding relevance. Furthermore, it is believed that the weapons used in the German school shooting that I mentioned were owned legally. However, Switzerland also allows people to obtain and own firearms legally, with one of the highest gun ownership and lowest crime rates in the world. But to my knowledge, Switzerland has never had a school shooting. Now, a common counter-argument to that is that Switzerland doesn't allow you to take your rifle from your home, load it, and bring it into a classroom and shoot people. Well, neither does Germany, but for some reason people obey the law in Switzerland, but not in Germany or in the United States. Prohibition as it stands has tended to result in failure. What I've noticed from my own observations is that the more desperate and hopeless a citizenry feels as a whole, the lower their standard of living is, the more likely they are to turn to drugs, whether they're illegal or not. I'm going to tell you about a drug called Crocodile. You can get this in southern Russia, and it's one of the most deadly on the planet. It's essentially a cheap, poor man's version of heroin. It's easy to make and obtain. However, homemaking it avoids the medical purification process needed to make the drug safe. The result is that a person can risk damaging their body tissue with only one dose. Furthermore, the average addict's lifespan is between 2 to 3 years. Crocodile's most noteworthy side effect is that it'll cause a person's skin to decompose, rot, and fall off. Crocodile is a drug you can get along the border with Kazakhstan. The same circumstance, I feel, explains why drug prohibition also doesn't work in the Gaza Strip. A lot of people feel hopeless and desperate, and drugs offer an alternative. Even though they risk the death penalty in the Gaza Strip, even though they risk death by the drug in southern Russia. The conclusion I have to reach is that making something illegal doesn't stop people from doing it. The circumstances that people live in decide if they're going to do it or not, and legality has little relevance. This would explain why some nations with harsh gun control still suffer kill sprees, in comparison to similarly harsh nations, such as South Korea, and less harsh nations, such as Switzerland, lacking kill sprees. Some other factor unrelated to gun prohibition is causing these differences. So prohibition as a concept doesn't work. Those without reason to break the law will obey it, not because the law works, but because people as a whole are less motivated to contest it. So this is the first practical issue of prohibition. It doesn't work. It's a cosmetic. Prohibition isn't what keeps people from doing drugs or shooting up schools, nor is the lack thereof inherently what saves people from violent crime. So this calls into question enforcement. How do you enforce prohibition to the point where it will legitimately reduce crime to a noteworthy degree? The common argument is that prohibition is harsh, but not harsh enough or enforced enough. So practically speaking, how can we make prohibition actually work? Well, first off, for the United States, we would need much harsher border control. In order to disable the risk of arms that can't be obtained legally simply being obtained illegally, you need to actually make it difficult to obtain illegal arms. And with the ease of transporting arms and drugs into the United States, this isn't feasible with our current situation. So imposing prohibition without imposing security reform would have no effect. So we have to consider the fiscal cost of supporting prohibition enough for it to be effective and cancel out a substantial portion of crime. Now, the next category would be, how much support does prohibition need? Well, if we want to create a circumstance where prohibition secures an individual more than a personal defense weapon, that scenario is not practically feasible, because a person can draw and fire their weapon in a few seconds. We would require armed police within response time. and that isn't practically feasible because you can't give every person a police officer. So that scenario can't practically take place. It's impossible. So the alternative solution is to tighten regulations enough that a firearm doesn't end up in the hands of a criminal, thus avoiding someone needing their firearm. However, with the current state of the United States, with smuggling weapons and drugs into the nation being an easy task, this would require massive financial support in order to not only round up and seize legal weapons that law-abiding citizens are willing to part with, but also prevent new weapons from coming in illegally, and track down illegally owned weapons to remove most of the currently existing ones. This is much easier said than done. The costs in enforcing this to a legitimate degree would be gargantuan, and tracking down illegal weapons already in the nation would be virtually impossible unless a legitimate trail has been left behind. So in summary, I lack substantial evidence to prove that prohibition is capable of doing much good. The only possible scenario in which it's even given a chance to do good requires massive financial backing. And for the United States of America, I don't think we have that kind of money that we're talking about. As always, I'm willing to hear counter-arguments to put forward fiscally responsible ideas that support gun prohibition, but as of yet, I haven't been offered one. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for my next video, where I will explain crime rates and put forward my theory to lower them, not just shooting, but drug use and crime as a whole. And that video will likely offend both sides of the prohibition debate. Stay tuned.